Hello, global gardeners, and happy Monday to you. For some of us, it's a little chilly and overcast, and there are frost in our futures, but it's fall. What do you expect? I think it's one of the best times of year. For those of you on the other side of the planet, Rick, you're just getting started with your season. That's just so fantastic. And so it's just a magical time where some of us are starting to have a drawdown in our gardens. Others are having that build up in our gardens. But most importantly, almost all of us are out in our gardens, whether it's warming or cooling. This is the time of year that almost all of us can actually garden. When we talk about winters and summers, that really limits many of us. But the fall and the spring are just some of my favorite times in the garden. I got a lot done this week on some of my big projects. You'll be seeing that in future videos, of course, and in the backgrounds when I get back out and start shooting my planting schedule for next year. But for now, it's a matter of figuring out what I'm going to do as my season wanes. I have already pulled the squash. I've already pulled the melons. I've been covering the peppers, so I'm still getting a little bit of harvest there. Even though I've touched on a few frosts, I'm still harvesting some tomatoes because one of the things that you might not be aware of till you actually grow big tomato plants is that when the plant gets to a certain size, it effectively protects itself when freezing conditions threaten. And so I have a whole bunch of tomatoes lined up in my beds. They're about 18 inches apart. The plants themselves spread a couple feet from the central stem. And all of those leaves and all those stems help to insulate the plant. And so while some of the outer leaves have damage as a result of the couple frosts that I've had, the plant as a whole is still doing okay. And a lot of the fruit that's in the inside portion of the plant is still available to harvest. So how often have you heard somebody tell you that the best way to protect a tomato plant is to grow a lot of tomato plants and let them grow very big? I'm guessing you probably haven't heard that before. There are so many tips and tricks and hacks and advice that we listen to on YouTube in particular that we want to try because somebody's telling us to try it. Which of that information is good for you? That's what we're going to be talking about today. I've never seen anyone say grow a lot of tomatoes close together so that they insulate themselves in fall as the weather cools. I just kind of discovered it. It just happened in my garden. And so it's something I do on a regular basis. And because it's something that I do and don't really think much about, I don't think it's made it to any of my videos so far or to any of the live streams. This is like the first time I've even brought up the subject. And so when we look at the advice and we look at the information and we look at what we're going to be doing in our gardens, that's what often happens. We hear a gardener say, "This really worked for me," and so we want to try it. Well, as you'll see through the course of today's show, I caution you whenever you have somebody that suggests that you try something new in the garden. It may be perfect for your unique garden space, but it might not be. So, on the surface, I'm guessing a number of you are like, wow, that's actually a great idea. Growing plants close together so they insulate each other in cool weather. I think I might give that a try. But what if you live in a very warm, very humid region? And so you have plants that are much more susceptible to diseases that like to take off over those plants that are always humid and wet. Well, growing tomatoes close, excuse me, growing tomatoes close together limits the air circulation. So it works well for me because I live in a very dry region here in Colorado. And so those leaves are insulating with those little pockets of air that are trapped within. But for a humid region, that same air could be the exact conditions that a bacterial or a viral disease would like in a tomato plant. And so just because it works for me does not mean it's going to work for you. And as you do more gardening and as you have more experience and as you're able to see what goes right and what goes wrong, I'm asking you today to be a little more analytical, to be more judgmental in some of those things that you're doing in your garden because of what somebody else says you should do. So that's the topic. Of course, along the way, we're going to be answering all your questions. So please throw out your questions. Heidi and Jay are with us today. We've got a lot of the regular crowd. It's already so nice to see the comments going back and forth. Heidi says, I always say to leave the burnt top of the plant intact. The frost cannot burn what already has been burnt. Works best in milder winter areas. Great tip. This is a great tip. And it's interesting that you say that because I do the same thing. And this is another one of those tips that I've never suggested to anybody, but it's a great idea. So now that Heidi is suggesting it, I'll second the notion. The idea being that when the frost hits, particularly when you have nice big bushy plants, it's the outside of the plant that's going to be affected. Or, as I've seen recently, I cover my pepper plants with plastic and I have my cattle panel hoops covering those plants. Well, even though the cattle panel hoop is almost 3 feet high, some of my pepper plants actually outgrew the hoop. And so the tips of those pepper plants have extended beyond the hoop. So when I cover those plants with my plastic sheet to keep them warm at night, when the frost hit, the tips of those plants that were touching that plastic were damaged by the frost, by those cold conditions. And I did exactly what Heidi is suggesting. I left those dead and dying tips on my pepper plants, partly because I knew I was going to keep covering and I didn't want more damage. So the damaged tips helped support that plastic. And she's right. They're already dead. They're not going to get any deader. And so when you have those outer fringes that have been damaged by cold or any other weather, it may make more sense to just go ahead and leave the damage. It isn't affecting the rest of the plant. The plant's going to shut off all of that dead material. And so it can be extra insulation. It can be that extra support for the plastic sheeting. Great idea. And this is maybe today we're going to come up with a lot of these tips and tricks that you've never heard before because that's how some of this stuff spreads gardener to gardener. I never thought really to share that I leave my dead tips on the plants, just like Heidi probably didn't think about it till right now. But it's this kind of information that can often really identify for each of us what we can try or should try in our gardens because it's somebody we know, it's someone we can relate to, and maybe somebody who can explain why they do it the way they do it, rather than just an anonymous YouTube video that the information just gets shared because they think it should be shared. The example I like to use is eggshells. How many videos have you seen suggesting that you bury eggshells in your garden soil, particularly around your tomato plants to increase the calcium? Because for some reason, it appears tomatoes are always deficient in calcium. Well, that advice is just wrong on so many levels. Our soils have ample amount of calcium. It's just whether we water efficiently to get that calcium into our tomato plants. The type of calcium in an eggshell is not the kind of calcium that is going to be used by our tomato plants. The eggshell itself is not going to decompose like we would think a compost pile decomposes organic matter. The eggshells are going to pretty much remain intact, potentially for years. unless you have a very acidic soil. So information like this sounds good on the surface. Our tomato plants need calcium. Eggshells have calcium, so we bury eggshells. And someone sees that, says, oh, I need to share this with everybody else I know. Whether they've ever tried it or not, they think it's information that needs to be shared. So they make a video talking about it. And then before you know it, you're surfing and watching all these videos on gardening because it's cold and it's winter and you're binging on topics, and you see 6 videos all in one sitting that talk about burying eggshells. And so you say to yourself, I think I'm going to bury eggshells in my garden. And next year, your tomatoes do great. And you say, must have been the eggshells. Well, there are so many other factors at play that I can assure you it wasn't the eggshells, but you're likely to share the information. So I try to share as accurate of information as I can at all opportunities. If I share something that I am doing personally in my garden, I do try to acknowledge that and have that caveat, if you will, that maybe it's something that works in my garden. And so take that at its face value. It may not work in your garden. You've got to do that extra analysis to really determine if it's something that'll work. And if you take the time to analyze whether eggshells are suitable for your soil, you'll find that they're not. And so you can save yourself a lot of effort by not doing some of the tips and tricks that you see recommended because you've delved a little bit deeper to find out the reasoning behind it in the first place and whether it really is accurate for you. And so just kind of keep that thought in mind. Jen says, in reference to the humidity in particular, that's exactly what I was thinking. In North Carolina, with the humidity and pest pressure, crowding plants is not an option. See, it's exactly my point. It works for me because of my dry humidity, and I just absolutely am amazed at the benefit of overcrowding plants. North Carolina, much more humid region, much more disease potential. It's something that you shouldn't necessarily consider. So thank you for saying that, Jen, because that's exactly my point. You have to take into account your specific region. The one thing that I do have in my garden that this year was a problem with my zucchinis. It was okay. My zucchinis were mostly done at that point. But powdery mildew. I had some of the worst powdery mildew that I've ever had in my zucchini plants this year. Powdery mildew can be lessened by pruning and increasing air circulation. It's the lack of air circulation that is really leading to a huge inflow of that powdery mildew and having a big impact on the plants. I let my zucchinis go. They were so prolific and so productive, and I just let the leaves grow because they were so big and beautiful, and I didn't have the air circulation that I had. So on my tomatoes, the lack of air circulation enabled me to get more tomatoes later in the season for harvest. The lack of air circulation on my zucchini led to an early death of some of those plants because basically all the leaves were affected and browned and died. But I loved the results of it because what I found with those zucchini plants is even after the powdery mildew had such an impact and so many of the leaves had fallen, it didn't kill the plant. The plant bounced back and sent out new growth and new flowers and new fruit, which I was not expecting at all. I've always treated powdery mildew as the death of the plant. It hits, I pull the plant, and that plant is done for the year. But this year, I left it in place just to see what would happen. And I was amazed that I got more fruit after the powdery mildew. And in years past, I never let the plant reach that point. So there's so much we can discover in our gardens by just letting things develop. And then seeing if it works. And if it works, then you can share it with other gardeners in your own community. Say, you live near me, our conditions are similar. This is something that worked for me. Why don't you give it a try? And then compare notes. And maybe you will discover a new way of doing something that works for you in your region that is counter to a lot of the information that you might see from other sources. So just kind of keep that stuff in mind, because I think it can be very important. Chris Garden in Allotment Journey is saying there's a lot of misinformation on YouTube, so everyone should use their common sense as to what is good and what can make you feel. Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. That's the underlying theme exactly for today's show. And so there were a couple things that really were the catalysts for me wanting to talk about this subject today. So the first one took place, I think, about midweek. Yeah, it was a Friday. So I had a video come out on Thursday, showed my paprika making. And I have all the peppers that I grew, and I dried them, and I made paprika. And I had a comment asking how I was able to grow the peppers so big. And it was an easy answer. I just put the plants into my raised beds with amended soil. That was it. I didn't do any fertilizing. I didn't do any special activities of any type. I just have good soil in my raised bed. So all I did was just put pepper plants in my raised bed and then watered them. That was it. And the plants did great. The peppers grew big and juicy and packed with flavor. And to be asked a question like that kind of threw me off a little bit, because I don't really think that much anymore about the steps to get to big peppers. Sure, I'll make videos about it. I'll talk about it in the live streams. But for me, it is that simple, because over the years, I've learned the importance of developing a good soil. So the question shouldn't be so much, how do you grow your peppers so big? It should be much more basic than that. It should be, how can you get your soil to the point that all you do is just put a plant in the ground and the plant is going to grow great? And that's something I think we often miss in our gardening journey, is we're looking for that tip, that trick, that hack, that quick fix to give us good results, when really it's a long process and there are many steps involved with that process. It takes years to get the soil good enough so that you can just put a plant in the ground and the plant does great. As you do your analysis and as you start comparing the information, try to break down what the real question is. The question isn't how you get your peppers to grow so big. The questions are much more basic than that. Look at how plants grow and how a seed grows. So for a seed to germinate, it's very simple. All it needs is moisture, some oxygen, and it needs an appropriate temperature. That's it. If you have a seed and it's warm enough and wet enough and there's some air around that seed, as long as it's viable, it's going to germinate. When you throw in the seedling and what it requires a few more things. It still requires the water, still requires the warmth, it still requires the oxygen, but now it requires light and it requires nutrients. That's it. That's why you can have hydroponic growing. You don't need to grow plants in soil. You just need some type of medium that provides the nutrients, and you need the light so that the plant can grow. But those handful of things are all that plants need. So as you start asking questions or start comparing information, break it down to those basic components. If you want to know about seeds, it's all about the moisture, the warmth, and the oxygen. That's simple. When you are talking about growing plants, you just add in the nutrients and the light. And so as you learn more about each of those components individually, now you start developing that information base that you can start growing better plants and get to the point that you can start sharing some of the successes in your garden and how you got to that point. I think that can be very, very important, and why that question really got me to start looking and thinking about the analysis of why someone would be asking a question and what my answer would be with that question. And so I always get a ton of comments. I know that that's something that you get a big YouTube channel, and many of you ask questions, and particularly like in these live chats have questions. So as you ask questions to someone that you think is knowledgeable, as you ask the questions on a video or in a live stream, or if you go to a gardening class, try to break it down to some of those basic components that maybe you don't understand. So if you're going to a class, or if you're uh, watching a video and it's talking about young seedlings or growing plants or putting seeds in the ground, ask a question about the temperature. I cover that pretty thoroughly in my videos as much as I can, because I recognize the importance of temperature when you're talking about growing plants. And so I don't put my plants in the ground until the soil temperature is appropriate. And when I start my seeds, particularly the pepper and the tomato seeds, I add warmth so that the germination is going to be better, because more warmth is better than less warmth when it comes to seed germination. And so you can see that by looking at those basic components, you really can figure out more about gardening. And when you have that foundational knowledge, a lot of the rest of the stuff really begins to fall into play, or fall into the discussion as to what you're going to do with the plants in the future. Frosty's Garden Adventure says, so it's not staying 20 degrees warmer on colder nights. And so this is one of those things that uh, as I always periodically review a lot of my basic knowledge. Let's talk about the temperatures right now. And so as the temperatures fall, particularly the nighttime temperatures, that really affects our plants during the harvest season. And so 20 degrees Fahrenheit is a big deal. And so that's about, I think, 14 or 15 degrees Celsius. And so when we look at the cooling temperatures at night, when they're not staying as warm as they were in the summer, you're going to see differences in how well your plants are performing, especially those tomatoes and those peppers. And when it starts getting too cold, they're not going to send out flowers anymore. And the fruit is going to ripen at a different rate. And the growth of the plant is going to change. So when I talk about plants needing warmth, it it's a range of warmth that affects the plants at different levels. So when a plant is young in spring, it might be able to handle some of those cooler temperatures. But then in the summer, it needs some of those warmer temperatures. And then in the fall, when it doesn't have those warm temperatures, everything changes. And so it's more than just the initial temperature that plants need. It's a range of temperatures throughout the lifespan of that plant. And learning those kind of things. So you can see how when I say start with the basics, and from there, that foundation leads to a greater understanding of gardening, that's a really good example of something as simple as the temperature, and that a plant needs a certain temperature to grow, that you can spend a lot of time looking into to find out what's the ideal temperature. What's the ideal temperature for germination? What's the ideal temperature for the plant to grow? What's the ideal temperature for the fruit to ripen? What's the ideal temperature for pollination of the flowers? Those are all different temperatures. And depending on the plants you're growing and where you're growing them, that can explain why your plant is doing well or why your plant isn't doing well. It might explain why all the flowers are dropping off the plants and not really giving you any fruit. Maybe it's too hot because there is an upper limit to those temperatures. So when we break gardening down to its basic components, I just think it's so fascinating. You'll never know everything you need to know to garden. I've been gardening for 35 years now. I've been a master gardener for 20 years. I've grown thousands and thousands of plants, and I still think I just know a fraction of what I should know to grow the things that I'm growing. I have a very successful garden, but I think it can be better. And I know there's a lot more that I need to know. Do I watch videos and look at that advice and think, oh, maybe I should try that in my garden? Well, of course I do. But then I look at another video on the same subject and compare the two and go, huh, maybe I shouldn't try that in my garden. And then often I'll come across those subjects and where one person says one thing and one person says another thing, and I go ahead and try it for myself so that I can see which one was more accurate and whether it's something that is appropriate for my garden. So I think it's awesome if you could get to that point where you know enough about those basics that you can start changing the variables. That's what experimentation is all about. You change the variables and then determine for yourself what's going to work and what's not going to work, and then carry that into the forward for each season after that. Pat Patrick says, could touch a bit on ground cover, especially hairy vetch. Sure. I love hairy vetch. I've mentioned that in some of my ground cover videos. I think hairy vetch is one of the best cover crops that you can put into the garden. So the idea behind a cover crop or a ground cover or a green manure, they're all essentially the same thing, is that you always have something growing in your garden. And so going into the winter, you put these plants in the ground and then they stay in place over the winter in most cases. And then in the spring, you have a couple different options as to what you do with those plants. So hairy vetch is actually a legume. It can actually add nitrogen from the air into root nodules and incorporate that nitrogen into the soil. And so it's grown often as a cover crop because of that leguminous activity where it can add nitrogen. I grow it for a number of different reasons. I have it underneath my tomato plants right now. So I have my tomato plants growing really close together, every 18 inches side by side. And then I have a straw mulch on top of that. Well, I had the hairy vetch seed in the soil underneath that straw. And so now I have a mat of hairy vetch growing underneath my tomato plants. So with the hard freeze, I'm expecting a hard freeze here probably Thursday. That's probably going to be cold enough that it will kill my tomato plants. So I will cut off the base stem of my tomato plants, remove my tomato plants, and I already have my ground cover in place. That vetch is already growing, and that will protect that soil in and through the winter. And then come spring, I'll just turn it all into the soil, adding biomass, adding organic matter to my soil, and it helps enrich the soil. So that's one of the ways that I use hairy vetch. You could do the same thing with many other types of cover crops, from Austrian peas to winter rye. And you can watch some of my videos. I'm sure Jay will link to some of my cover crop videos that talk about some of those different plants. The idea being that you cover the ground. If the ground is exposed to the bare sun, the UV rays can actually damage the soil life in those top couple inches. You also have weed seeds that blow in, and so now the weed seeds are going to sprout in spring, and you got to deal with those issues. If you're gardening on a slope, you've got erosion problems. So you put plants like hairy vetch that grows pretty tall if it grows up a trellis, but if you let it roll on the ground, it covers a good section of ground. I also like the hairy vetch, particularly because it comes back every year. the flowers are just beautiful. And they are some of the very first flowers in spring. So I also grow hairy vetch as a pollinator plant because in early spring, the only plants that are feeding the bees in my area are dandelions and hairy vetch. And so all kinds of ground covers that you can put into play. And so there is technically a difference between ground cover and a green manure like we're talking about with the hairy vetch. And it just that the hairy vetch is most commonly used in that purpose. There are other ground covers that I like that do well in my area. Ice plant is one of the favorites. Ice plant is actually an African plant. Typically, South Africa is identified as where the ice plants originated. I love ice plants. They do extremely well in my cold winter region, hence ice plants, because they can handle some really icy conditions. I love that as a ground cover. I love vinca as a ground cover. It comes down to what you want. I like the plants that flower. I love the flowers of the vinca. I love the flowers of the ice plant in particular. I will mulch my open ground beds in the areas that I'm using those kind of ground covers, and then just let them take over. Just let them keep growing and spreading, and before you know it, you've got an area that's covered with plants that, in my case, because I like the flowers, they're producing flowers. In other cases, it's helping to cut down on potential erosion problems, cutting down on weeds. So, yeah, cover your ground, whether it's a cover crop or a ground cover in another area because it looks good. Cover your soil so that you're helping all the life within the soil and avoiding some of those things like having to weed and deal with the issues that are in place because you didn't cover your soil. Okay, let's see. Yeah, DLR 978 says a new acquaintance mentioned starting seeds and eggshells recently, and that specifically was the other thing that got me thinking about it because I saw one of those videos, 50 hacks to help a gardener kind of a thing. And the first one was starting seeds in eggshells. And then they said, and all you have to do is just plant the eggshell in the ground, and the eggshell will improve the soil and the roots will grow through it. Again, eggshells are just one of my pet peeves. That just, first off, the eggshell really isn't big enough to support the growth of a seedling. And then really the roots of a young seedling are going to grow through an eggshell. No, sorry, just doesn't work that way. But uh, I would suggest you tell your acquaintance that there's a lot of better ways to start seeds. Look at some of my many videos on seed starting, and chances are you'll have better success than attempting to put them into an eggshell for that initial growth. But it's people spreading information because they don't know any better. I'm guessing a lot of those videos are made by video groups that look at some magazine or come across a list and say, oh, we need to make a video about this. And they use stock footage, and they're probably not even gardeners and have never even tried it because a lot of the information in some of those crazy videos really makes no sense for those of us that have actually done it. Tennessee Nana says, I'll dry and chop up eggshells. My neighbor's chickens love them. And he says it's supposed to be good for them. Oh, yeah, absolutely. The eggshells really serve a better purpose when you feed them back to the chickens because they can use the calcium in the eggshells to then make more eggs. And they need that calcium component in their diet. So yes, that is a much better way to use the eggshells, is to feed them back to the chickens. And my son does that with his chickens. The laying chickens, you toss all that back into the chickens, and you don't even need to crush them. You can actually throw the mostly whole, crack open the egg and throw the eggshells back into the run where the chickens are, and they'll eat it. They'll peck it into little pieces and then swallow it because they also need grit in their gizzard to help with their digestion. So sure, you can grind them up, but that's not even necessary. The chickens will take care of that part of the process themselves. So save yourself a step. Okay. Nice to see so many people here today that are the regulars. And thanks, Mike. I appreciate your weekly comment. Masabi Gal says, I've been feeding the cooked eggshells to the chickens, and then I get the calcium out of their bedding litter. There you go. So the chicken manure is a great addition, and especially in the bedding when the manure is mixed with straw or wood shavings or whatever you use. Oh, that can be a great way to start a compost pile. And a lot of the nutrients, to include calcium, it can come from doing something like that. So always a good idea. Let's see. Brian's Garden says lactic acid bacteria really took care of the powdery mildew for me this year. Cool. Yeah, there's, I haven't used lactic acid specifically, though. I actually have saved bottles of lactic acid after I do my fermenting, but have never used them to actually spray any of my plants. But I have seen a little bit of research on that as far as a fungicide to use a lactic acid. And so that's a good idea. I might actually have to follow through with that one of these days to use my fermentation remains as a full year spray. Gardens Happen says, I want to get the second Garden Myths book. I look at these gardening tips and tricks and compare them to scientific studies. Yeah, Garden Myths, that's one of the channels that I watch. And he's been much more prolific lately as far as a lot of the videos that he's doing. But he does a really good job. I'll say there's only been a couple times over the many years. I have the first Garden Myth book and watching his videos as well. There's only been a couple times that I didn't agree with what he said, but he is pretty good when he puts his personal spin on things. Most of what he talks about is scientifically based. And so I forget what it was. I think it was in the book, and I don't remember what it was, but he said something and I thought, no, that's just not right. But he said, I forget the wording, but he basically said, this is my personal opinion and this is something I try. And he didn't support it with any research or scientifically based information. But except for those couple times when and like I'm saying today, look at the individual saying it and whether it is something that they are saying to do just because. And by him acknowledging a personal preference as opposed to a research-based finding, I think that's very important. And that's the kind of source that I would recommend that you use for comparative purposes. And so, a lot of these things, like talking about eggshells, for instance, Kevin at Epic Gardening did a video a year or two ago, I think, talking about the same thing, how it's a myth and it doesn't make any sense. And I think David the Good has covered this subject. So when you look at me and some of these other favorite sources of yours, and we're all saying the same thing, it probably has a little more validity, what we're saying. And so maybe you can try it. But even then, it might not be appropriate for you in your garden. So you still have to take it to the next level and still have to try it and then do your own analysis to figure out if it is something that works or something that doesn't work for you in your garden. I keep stressing that over and over again because all of our gardens are different. And that's why we need to personalize our information. Science Saves has a tip. My superpower this year was using AI in my garden. Anytime I heard a suggestion or saw an idea on YouTube, I would ask ChatGPT if, fill in the blank, would work for my specific situation. It's worked great. Awesome. And that's, it's funny you say that. I was just talking yesterday with some friends about AI in particular. And I think that's a great thing, particularly on the Google searches now. If you look up at a subject, it often starts with the AI answer. It's not always right, but it's a good place to start. Uh, Beginning of the year, I think it was, I'm trying to think, maybe February or March, I came across some information about the mechanism of training AI. And it said that we as YouTube creators can actually go to this site and enter in some of our information, and it would tell us if our information had been used to educate some of the AI that is out there. And so I did that. And yeah, Gardner Scott videos have been used to educate AI. And and in this one source I saw, it actually compared a number of some of the different sites. And sure enough, Epic Gardening's videos, a lot of the other big channels, their videos. And so the information that's on AI is being drawn from some reputable sources like me and others. It's not a guarantee that all of the information is coming from a reputable source. So it's a great place to start. I love the idea. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Whether it's Chat GPT or some other source, use that as a starting point to check the information and see if it's appropriate. So I think that's a great superpower. You've already figured out that, yeah, you need to be checking the information rather than just taking it at face value. So, wonderful suggestion. And AI is becoming more and more appropriate for some of the things that we might want to use it for. Brian's Garden says, agree with Gardner Scott. A healthy living soil is all you need for a great garden. 2 years, no outside fertilizers. That's awesome. Yeah, I've been gardening for many, many years with no fertilizers in my outside beds. And you can see the results in, this time of year when I'm making those videos in the garden and you see how great my garden looks. It's all because of that healthy living soil, as Brian says. Absolutely. And it takes a while to get to that point. But when you do, oh, it makes a big difference. Lynn Potes is asking, some of the videos I've seen about overwintering peppers emphasize sterilizing the roots and soil for indoors. How important is this? So this gets back to your garden and your region to determine how important it is. So the idea behind it, and I've talked a little bit about this in the past, is so much of how we are instructed to garden. A lot of these tips and tricks, a lot of the books and the videos assume that we have disease in our garden. They assume that we have pests in our garden. So when you look at advice like sterilizing the roots and the soil, that's assuming that there is disease and potentially pest eggs in the soil. And it makes perfect sense if you have a garden that has disease and pests in it. My garden soil doesn't have the disease in it. The only disease I have is powdery mildew, and that's an airborne spore. It's not going to be in the soil. And so I don't sterilize my soil or I don't sterilize my roots if I am overwintering something because I know I don't have any of those disease components in my soil. So I don't need to do it. I also know that I don't have soil-borne pests on any of those plants that I would be overwintering. And so that's really a big factor when you look at some of the advice. Is it appropriate for you? And getting down to that basic foundational information. Why is it being recommended? It's being recommended because of those assumptions. I've mentioned this before in my raspberry patch. I have red raspberries and yellow raspberries and black raspberries. And if you go online and do a search on how to plant black raspberries, almost all of those sources essentially repeat the same information. And they say, don't plant black raspberries next to red raspberries. Why? I wanted to know why when I first saw that. So I delved deeper. It's disease. The black raspberries are more susceptible to disease and can pass that to the red raspberry plants. I don't have raspberry diseases in my garden. I've got black and red raspberries growing side by side. Neither of them have disease. It's not an issue if you understand the why something is being recommended. And so, how important is it, Lynn? It depends. If you've got a disease and pest problem, then yeah, sterilizing might be beneficial. You don't have to go crazy about it. You maybe use hydrogen peroxide as a way to deal with it, but you might want to consider it. It's the same with compost or reusing uh, a, a potting mix. It's the same basic idea when you see recommendations to sterilize your potting mix before you use it. Well, if you make your own potting mix and you don't have disease issues, you can reuse that potting mix over and over again. Just revitalize it with some new materials. That's what I do every year. I've got potting mix in my bin right now that I started at the beginning of the year. I'll use it again this next year. At the end of the season, or at the end of my seed starting, if some of the plants didn't survive because they were overwatered or underwatered or the light was off or whatever the situation was, I'll just dump that mix from those little pots back into my bin. I reuse it all the time because I don't have any of those diseases that might affect the seedlings during that initial growth pattern. A lot of people do. And the humidity plays a big factor in those wet, damp regions of the country. And a lot of videos and a lot of books come from those wet, damp regions. Yes, it's a bigger problem. And that's why you see some of those recommendations being made. But do take it with a grain of salt as to whether it really makes sense for you. And, almost always, if you're not sure whether you should do a corrective action like that or not, and you know how to do that corrective action, and you are aware that that corrective action is not going to cause more problems, then default to be most conservative, to be safest. And sure, you can sterilize your potting mix and sterilize any soil that you might be using for overwintering, but be aware that you're sterilizing the soil. One of the best things about using your own potting mixes is because it probably isn't a sterile mix. So you have some of that soil life in there, then you need that soil life to release the nutrients to the plants. So by sterilizing everything, you're basically killing all the life that's in that potting mix or in that garden soil. So uh, you can take the safe approach and go ahead and sterilize everything, realizing that it may potentially cause some other issues further down the line or not, and then see what happens. The bigger concern, I think, for many of us isn't the sterilizing of the soil and cleaning the roots. It's any of the leaves and stems and the potential that you could bring aphids or mites or any other type of pest from outside inside, and now they'll infect your indoor plants. So I would rather spend the time spraying off the top of the plant and doing everything I can to eliminate some of those outside pests that I might have in the garden from becoming an indoor problem and then having to deal with them. I had that issue pop up at the school garden years ago with scale that was affecting a lemon tree that I had inside. And I spent a lot of time dealing with that problem once it got indoors. And if you can keep it from coming indoors, that's really what you need to do. I have a pomegranate bush that is outside now, and pomegranates need exposure to some cold temperatures, but they can't handle the cold freezing temperatures. So it's about time for me to bring that pomegranate indoors. That's what I'm going to do with that pomegranate. Actually, either today or tomorrow, is spray it really well, spray off the leaves, and try to make sure that there's no pest on that pomegranate before I bring it indoors, so that I don't unintentionally bring a problem to my houseplants. I don't have many houseplants, and they probably wouldn't suffer any more than just my neglect that I give them. But it is something to be aware of as you start looking at what you're bringing into the garden. Pantelis 2010 says, "Hi Scott and friends, hello to you. My garden is full of bulbs, namely Montbritia. I want to get rid of them. Is there a way other than digging them out? If I put layers and layers of cardboard, maybe?" So yeah, suffocation or covering can be an effective way of killing something. Now, the thing about bulbs, and this holds true for just about all the bulbs. So there's a lot of energy stored in those bulbs to generate the growth of a plant. And so covering them with layers of cardboard and then maybe wood chip mulch on top of that will eventually starve the bulbs. They will still sprout, they'll still grow because they've got the energy in the bulb to grow. They're not getting any sunlight, so there's no more photosynthesis, no more creation of energy back into the bulb. But that might not be enough to kill the bulbs in a single year. It may actually take a couple years for all the energy in those bulbs to be dissipated. The additional benefit when you do a smothering technique like that is that it could create a very damp environment that could also potentially increase the rot potential. So when you have something covering a bulb that's trying to grow, by making the environment too wet and not enough light, now you have kind of a double pincer attack on those bulbs to help eventually get rid of them. But it may take a while. That's why some of those really invasive grasses that grow with rhizomes under the ground can be so difficult to eradicate because they'll just keep growing until all of the energy has dissipated from those rhizomes, or in this case, from the bulbs. So sure, give it a try with the smothering technique, and it doesn't involve any digging, and it may take a couple years, and then you can use that space to grow other things, which is what I'm guessing you want to do, and why you don't want to do all the digging. Hey, Tony, Simplified Gardening. I love hairy vetch, field beans, and ryegrass, all excellent for green manures. Also, clovers are great as they are a biofumigant and can help get rid of any disease. Yeah, I don't grow many clovers, but yes, they're always very high on my list. I totally agree with you, Tony. All good stuff for green manures for cover crops, and I would put clover definitely into the ground cover category. If it's an area that you're not planning on turning over the clover, but maybe you might want to plant something in that area in the future, yeah, clover is an ideal plant for something like that. And again, I like the clover flowers. Bees love clover flowers, so that can be a real nice thing to add to your garden. Jen is asking, any recommendations for cover crops or green manure suitable for shady areas? So many of the plants that we've been talking about can actually do okay in shaded areas. Hairy vetch does great in full sunlight, but like I mentioned, they're underneath my tomato plants right now, pretty much full shade because my tomato plants are so big and they just are growing great. So most of the cover crop plants that we talk about and that we grow uh, don't need a lot of light. They grow in fall and they grow in spring when there's very little sunlight, and so that's essentially the equivalent of a shady area. Now, full shade, I can't speak to that because I don't have any areas with full shade. But as far as low light areas, most of the plants that we've already talked about can actually do really well. Lynn says, I'm concentrating on seed collecting this year. I live in Denver. Is there conventional wisdom about seed viability from collecting? I actually have a video. I don't know if Jay has, I know I'm a little bit behind on time. Jay may have already linked to my video, but I have a seed viability video that I did earlier this year, I think it was, where I talk about some of these things. Conventional wisdom says that different seeds last different amounts of time. And so it depends on the seed. And I have another video that I did, I think, a year or two ago, where I talk about how long seeds last. And I break it down by the most common plants and tell you what the conventional wisdom is for how long those seeds will last. So, for instance, onion seeds remain viable for 1 year. Most of our vegetable garden plants, like carrots, for example, remain viable for 3 years. The bigger plants that we're growing in our garden, like the peppers, can be viable for 5 years. Tomatoes, 7 or 8 years. So that's the general conventional wisdom. But it all comes down to how you store your seeds as to how long they will remain viable. And of course, I have another video on how to store seeds so that they retain their viability. So the basic idea is it varies by seed. And if you do a good job of storing in a cool, dark, dry location, you can actually extend that time. So even though everywhere you look will say that carrot seeds will remain viable for 3 years, I've grown carrot seeds that were 5 years old and they still did fine because I'm storing my seeds in an appropriate location that actually gets the best out of those seeds. So yeah, you can check out some of my videos and maybe it'll give you a lot more information for what you're looking for the seed viability, because I save all my seeds. And I think that is great that you want to do more of your own seed saving. That is a fantastic part of the gardening journey, is to reach that point that you start saving your own seeds and then germinating your own seeds to grow the next year. So good for you. I think seed saving is a great skill to have. And I think it's something that more gardeners should do. Big Wilt Dog, good to see you. I've been on such a bioassay kick with my amendments that I put a video together that shows how I do it. Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out. Testing for herbicides first protects my soil. Cool. I'll have to take a look at that. I'm big on doing testing of the soil. So I think that's a great idea. And of course, herbicides, if you're not using herbicides in your garden, that doesn't mean that herbicides are not affecting your garden, because things like the straw that you're using might have some herbicide residue on it. If your neighbors have gardens and they use herbicides, some of that might blow into your garden. And so understanding what to look for the potential of herbicide damage and then what to do about it, that's an important component in developing the information that you use in your garden. And then doing something like a bioassay, I think, is a great idea. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to catch up. I realize I'm about 20 minutes behind in the comments, but I am trying to cover as much as I can today. Chris is saying, haven't seen a video of you in the garden for a while. Are you still making them? I must admit, I love your lives, but would love more of your videos giving us all advice. So yeah, in fact, I just had a video that came out this last Thursday. Actually, I don't show much of me being outside, but the video I did a few weeks ago where I'm planting the saffron crocus, that was all outside in my garden. So I'm still making videos. I'm not doing 2 a week like I was a couple years ago, but I mentioned last week in the live chat that sometimes you have to kind of reboot the algorithm on YouTube. If you start watching other videos, then videos like mine drop out of your your homepage. And so when you go to your homepage and you see the recommended videos, it's going to be based primarily on what you've been watching recently. And so this time of year, Halloween, and you've been watching a lot of videos on how to make Halloween costumes, uh, and you haven't watched a Gardner Scott video, chances are you're not going to be recommended Gardner Scott videos. You're going to be recommended videos on how to make Halloween costumes. So go back to my homepage and you'll see some of the recent videos I've done, and I'll be doing more. But yeah, I haven't made as many as I've had in the past, but I'm still making them. And I've got another one coming out next week, and I should have another one coming out the week after that. So they're still coming. This is getting into the slow time of year, so there won't be as many videos, but they're still coming. You just might have to to go back and watch some so that the algorithm knows you're still interested. In that case, the algorithm will say, "Oh, you still want to see those gardening videos?" and it'll start recommending more and more of them for you. I'm already doing that. I'm planning. I think I mentioned this before. I'm planning a couple big trips next year, and so I'm starting to do a lot of research and a lot of planning for those trips, and that includes YouTube videos. And so now on my feed, I get very little gardening recommendations. There's still a lot of gardening videos being made, but I don't get very many gardening recommendations because what's being recommended is videos on those places that I'm planning to go next year. And that's just the way the algorithm works. And so anyway, earlier I'd mentioned there were a couple reasons why I wanted to talk about this topic today. That was the second reason, was that one of the videos that was recommended to me from just a couple days ago was put these plants in your garden in November. And sure, November is coming. There are a lot of gardeners wondering if they could grow something in November, and they see a video on plant these plants in November, and they might give it a try. They obviously don't live in Colorado because hard freezes are coming. My ground is going to be frozen probably in about a month, and there's not a lot that I can grow in my garden in November. And so I see a video like that, and I see it as a waste of time because I know I can't grow anything in my garden in November at 7,000 foot elevation in the mountains of Colorado. It just doesn't work. I've learned that. Most gardeners have to learn it. They'll watch a video on what to plant in November, and then they'll plant it, and then they wonder why it's killed when the temperature drops down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 Celsius. That's because none of the stuff that you're going to be wanting to grow in your garden can survive at that low of a temperature. If it survives, it's going to be dormant. It's not growing. So be really hesitant when you see those kind of videos telling you what you should be growing in your garden in any month of the year, because it may be something that you're really wasting your time doing. You're wasting the seeds, you're wasting the plant, you're wasting your time, and it's good information to learn about what doesn't work for you. But then again, if you live in Louisiana or Florida or South Carolina or San Diego, it might work for you. And I'm guessing, I didn't watch the video because I knew it didn't apply to me, but it's probably someone that lives in one of those areas saying what you can grow in November. Go for it. I just I just would like to see some of those videos a little more uh, specific in the title, like what to grow in November in Florida and Louisiana. Now it's appropriate. And a gardener who lives in Ohio or Illinois is not going to be sucked into making a huge mistake because they're a new gardener and they don't know any better. So it's all about our own gardens, what does best for us, and then what we choose to do with it. And so that's going to lead us right now to the photo that's behind me today. This comes from Don Kessel. Thank you, Don, for supplying this. This is just a portion of Don's garden, but I think it's awesome. And there's I could talk a lot about this, but I'll try to do it in just a few minutes. And so I look at this first off as a gardener who likes a big garden as, wow, look at all of this potential. Look at all this space. Look at all the extra beds that haven't been built yet. And that's what this is. This is an area outside the main garden area, and it's an expansion spot. And so my garden, especially this year when I added my stone beds, as I do more expansion in my garden, I do new things. I don't do everything the same way I did it. So all of my new beds are different than all my old beds. And the plants I grow are different than the plants I grew years ago. So there's always that opportunity, if you have space to expand your garden, to try something new and to grow differently. And so as you look at these beds, these are both raised beds. They are so unique. And so use these as examples of what you can do in your garden. So I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that this bed that's growing the asparagus, it looks to be either a big tire or something similar to that. The indentations on it, I think it looks like it's made from plastic or rubber. But great idea. You don't have to make all of your raised beds out of wood. Look at other materials. All of your raised beds don't need to be rectangles and squares. Grow in a round raised bed. I've got those feeding troughs for some of my beds, oval beds. I love them. I also have the oval metal beds from the kids, all kinds of different shapes. I've got a hexagonal metal bed. So adding different shapes to the garden also helps break it up. And then different colors and paint schemes. I love it. The wood bed that is over my shoulder here, I love the trellis. And so when you want to grow something like a squash or a melon, this is another one of those experiences. So often, those of us who have grown in open beds, you might have nothing but open beds, and you're growing the squashes and the melons, and they spread out. And so you have a favorite squash, and you know what it looks like. Now try growing that up a trellis. And the thing about a trellis, like you can see behind me, is that when the plant grows up the trellis and then the fruit drops through the trellis and starts growing downward, you have gravity working on that fruit. And so some of those squashes and melons that might be round or oval when we grow them on the ground, when you grow them up a trellis, they now become elongated and they can become long and cylindrical, which is a lot of fun. And especially if you're growing something like loofah gourds or cucumbers, growing them up a trellis gets you a nice, long, straight fruit with no curves. It's perfectly straight because gravity has straightened it. So I love the idea of growing up trellises. I love even more the idea of allowing the fruit to drop through the trellis and give you the perfect shapes that you might be looking for when you're growing in a bed. So the bed, a beautiful wooden bed with a beautiful wooden trellis. Look at the knobs at the top of the crossbars. A wonderful visual element, obviously a very effective trellis for this bed that's filled with these vining plants. I love it, absolutely love it. And then I always talk about sitting areas in the garden. Look at the nice little bench that Don built at the front of this bed. And so just some corbels, you could go to the craft stores and find wooden corbels like that. And that's a great idea, to put a corbel on the side of a bed and then to put a plank on top of it. And you've now created a nice little sitting area or kneeling area or storage area. I love that idea. And then if you look off to the side, you'll actually see that there's a narrow bed running alongside the side of the bed that has the vining plants in it. So always looking for other planting areas outside of a main planting area. Love that idea. A big planting area for big plants and a small planting area for small plants. all enclosed in the same space. So some really good ideas here. Make notes of some things that you might see. You can also, if you look close, see the little fencing around the edges of the bed to help keep out dogs or any other pests that might be wanting to climb into that bed. So I love this. As simple as this might look in the beginning, and you might look at this and go, oh, that's a small garden. But oh, no, it says so much more. And there's so much more behind the camera that you can't see. I think it says just a bundle of information with just a couple images. So what do you see in this picture? What other kind of things? Something, like an asparagus growing in a raised bed as a perennial plant. That's what I do. So it's a great way to segregate the perennial plants from the annual plants by devoting bed space to something along those lines. So always good. Jan, Ron, and Arthur says, thank you, moderators and Scott, for your time, knowledge, and resources. Always appreciated. Well, thank you for saying that. It is always nice to feel appreciated. And yeah, Heidi and Jay do such a great job with keeping all of this online. I was talking, so I was on a live stream this last week talking about soil and the biology of soil. And before the show, we had been talking a little bit about moderators, and we just have such a great community here. So many other channels really need the moderators because of the trolls, because of just the verbal abuse that takes place on so many other channels. And we just don't have that. And the few times, and I mean just a couple times over the years that it's happened on this channel, Heidi and Jay are right on top of it, keeping people in line. But more importantly, they help the conversation and they add some very good information along the way. So I appreciate you both as well. And thank you for being here on a regular basis as well. Dead Grower, hello to you in Norway. It's so fantastic to see our community and have everybody checking in like this. It's fantastic. Serena is asking, how do you amend your green stock? This is my first year having one and I have issues. I have a video on this. I've got a whole bunch of green stock videos, but I show exactly how I deal with my green stock in the spring. By taking it apart and amending the soil, revitalizing the soil. I think that's the name of the video, is revitalizing soil in a green stock or something like that. Jay will probably have it up in no time. But I show you step by step how to do that. So just check out my video on growing in a green stock and taking care of the soil, and that'll help you out. And basically, it's just replenishing any nutrients that might have been lost over the course of a season's growing. And I'll be doing that again because my green stocks days are numbered. And so I probably won't have anything in the green stock again. Well, I won't have anything in the green stock again until next spring. And I'll be taking care of the soil before I put anything else into it. Chris Garden, how big is your garden actually, Gardener Scott? Mine is massive, but yours has been looked after. What was it like when you started? So I have videos on this. So you can actually go back 5 years. So June 5 years ago is when I moved into this house. And I started making videos right away. And one of the first videos I did was about planning my garden. And there was nothing here. And so when you go back to those first videos of mine 5 years ago, I had nothing. What was it like when it started? It was flat and covered with native plants, mostly grasses. That's it. Nothing. And from there, I developed a plan and I built beds and it's expanded. And so so I live on half an acre and it's mostly in the back where my primary garden areas are, where I do most of my filming. My front portion is landscaped. I do show how I did that in some of my older videos. Now most of the focus is on the back. So when you look at the overall space, about a third of an acre is what I have in my backyard that I'm growing on right now. And so, as you can see in a number of my videos, the ones I've made this summer, a lot of beds, my greenhouse, my fruit trees, my fruit bushes, my pergola, the gazebo. There's a lot happening in that space now. And you can actually see the progression in my videos over the course of 5 years. I had someone comment to me about it this week in one of my more recent videos saying, it's amazing the progress that I've made in these last 5 years from nothing to a pretty expansive garden area. And so, all told, I haven't actually added up everything, but my vegetable growing area is about 800 to 1,000 square feet of bed space for growing vegetables. And then my pollinator garden area is about 1,000 square feet of growing space. And then my greenhouse is 3 meters by 4 meters. My open area where I've got trees and the fruit bushes in, that is also a couple thousand square feet. So a lot of space, and it has evolved quite a bit over the years from literally just being nothing to being a full-fledged garden now. So check it out. You can actually compare side by side videos. Watch an old one and watch a new one, and there's some big differences. Mobius is saying, mostly I think bad thoughts about monoculture. I was just having this conversation yesterday. Yeah, if there's anything, I don't typically say don't do something in the garden. Again, every garden is unique. Every gardener has their way of gardening. But if there were one thing I would strongly advise against, it's monoculture. It's growing the same plant in all of the beds. Now, if you only have one bed and all you want to grow is tomatoes, go for it. Yes, technically that's a monoculture, but that's not a big deal. It's when you have a whole bunch of beds and a whole bunch of open space, and all you do is grow one plant. Unless you are a market gardener, I would advise against it because you really are inviting pests and disease problems. And if a pest and disease finds that one crop, everything could be devastated. And so variety is just so important. And even if there is a particular type of plant you want to grow different varieties, grow different types of that plant, and that will help reduce the issues of pest and disease. So, yeah, I would caution about doing a lot of monocultures in the garden space. But most of us don't. Most of us are growing tomatoes and peppers and squash and melons and eggplant and carrots and spinach, and the list goes on. And as long as you're growing a lot of different plants, the likelihood of having everything suffer is just so minimal that you're always going to have some success. That's a big reason why I think variety is important in the gardens, because there's always something that does really well, along with the stuff that doesn't do so well. And it's all educational. Okay. This is good. I'm enjoying the chat today. And it's so nice to see everybody here. Outlier Gardener, always great to have you here. And thank you for that. I agree. Another fantastic live. I've achieved my purpose today. Hopefully, it has most of you thinking about the information. I'm wearing flannel. It's flannel season again because it's just cold at night and cold in the morning, and the furnace is kicking on before I get out of bed, and it's just going to get worse. It's going to get colder, and I'm going to have to bundle up more when I go outside. What that means for me, it's education time. It's time for me to watch even more videos, to read more books, to see more blogs, and to make more plans for my garden for next year. That's the best time of year, I think, is when you're sitting indoors and you can't be outside. Spend it inside doing gardening in the form of garden planning, seed ordering, educating yourself. All of those things are wonderful cold weather activities. And even for those of you like Rick who are just getting into the hot season and growing your plants, don't forget to do that. Don't get so tired working in the garden in summer that you fail to take some time to educate yourself. Every morning, I take time to watch more videos and to read more blogs and to get information about gardening. And I've been doing this forever, and I've been teaching it for 20 years. And I still spend time every day learning more about gardening. Because, like I said earlier, you can never know everything you need to know. And so you can get close. Imagine if you spent an hour a day, every day, learning about gardening. In a year, taking time off for holidays, sure, for some travel time, but that's 300 hours a year that you spend on gardening. Compare that to a college education and how much time you actually spend in your major area of study to get a degree. Now multiply that by a few years, multiply it by a decade. In my case, I've been spending at least an hour a day for the last 5 years. 1,500 hours plus on gardening information, just me, as I try to make myself a better gardener. It's easy. All you got to do is have the time. And how else would you spend that time? If you're spending an hour in front of your television, why not spend that time watching YouTube videos on subjects that you might be interested in that pertain to gardening? So it's not that you need to take time away from your family or your other hobbies. It's how you prioritize your time. And for me, it's no surprise, gardening has a high priority. And so that's why I spend so much time always trying to get better, always trying to figure out new ways of doing things, different ways that might intrigue me a little bit. I have fun learning about gardening, and I have even more fun seeing what happened. I think some of it comes out in the video that I did last week, my paprika video. I had to tone down my excitement. I really did, because I was so excited with the results. A year ago, I started talking about planning to grow peppers, to grow Hungarian peppers for the purpose of making my own paprika. A year ago, I started talking about doing that, and I did it. And I chose Hungarian varieties, both hot, spicy, and sweet. And then I went through the whole process and made paprika. Highlight of my year, easily. I planned to do it. I set myself up for success. I had success, and it was overwhelming, the results. And now I just have to figure out what I'm going to do next time, because there will be a next time for what the big project will be for next year, as I figure out what I'm going to grow and why I'm going to grow it, and then go through the whole process of growing it. So that's how I approach gardening. And that's why, for me, it stays exciting. That's why I don't get bored with gardening, because I'm always pushing the limits and always finding that new thing to do. And even some of the melons that I grew this year, typically, like banana melons are a good example, because I just enjoyed a delicious banana melon yesterday for the first time. So I grew, as many of you know, plants I'd never grown before. And I typically don't grow melons because they don't do well here in Colorado because of the short season and because I've just never grown many melons before. And so I grew a Kajari melon. Fantastic. My daughter loved it. I will grow it again. Banana melon didn't ripen. It was taking forever. I had big banana melons that were still green. And then the frost threatened. So what did I do? Well, I did something that I knew to do, but I couldn't remember ever doing before. And that was to go ahead and harvest the melon And then I put it in my greenhouse where it was warm and it was still exposed to the sun to allow it to continue to ripen. And it took a few days, but it went from green to yellow. And I then took them indoors, and yesterday cut open the banana melon. Fantastic. So that's another one of those. I'm going to try something new, see what happens. Doesn't go exactly as planned. So I need to shift a little bit, harvest, put in the greenhouse, then eat it. Worked like a champ. Will it work for you? Maybe. So if that's something that you might want to try in the future, just kind of stick it in the back of your brain that with squashes, you can do the same thing. That's why or other squashes or squashes and melons, you can do the same thing. So the reason I ended up doing it is because my pumpkins weren't turning orange and the frost threatened. So I went ahead and harvested the pumpkins, put them in the greenhouse, and they turned orange. It's amazing that that's the way that the fruit develops. But when you see it in practice, it now is ingrained in your mind as maybe a regular activity. You know, I can't grow some things because my season is just too short. Well, yeah, I can if I take those extra steps to get a fruit that's actually able to eat by harvesting it early and then allowing it to ripen. Tomatoes, same thing. Harvest your tomatoes early, they'll ripen on your kitchen counter. So there's a lot of extra opportunity in gardening when we define our growing season and what we can and can't do. It's a guideline. You do some extra effort on the front side to protect your plants, you can gain another week or two. You do some stuff on the backside, you can gain another week or two. And suddenly you've got a longer growing season. But all of our seasons are different. So what works for me, I might be able to gain 3 weeks. You might actually be able to gain 6 or 7 weeks if you've got a different weather pattern than the way my Colorado fall just suddenly plummets the temperature to a hard freeze overnight. If yours is more gradual, some of those corrective actions might gain you an amazing ability to grow some plants that you never thought you could. So that's why I love gardening. That's why I watch a lot of videos. And that's why I try to learn as much as I can. Brian's Garden, thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it greatly. And it's always great to have you here. And I thank you for contributing and supporting the channel. That means a lot. And of course, thanks to all of you that do such a great job supporting me, the channel, this community, each other. Is just so fantastic. I wanted to mention, and because I do this regularly, if somebody comes up to me when I'm out and about and they recognize me and they make the effort to say hello, I'll stand and talk and get to know a little bit about them. And that happened again recently with Steve at the supermarket, and saw me, and he kind of paused, looked at me, and said, "Are you that gardener guy?" And I said, "Yeah, Gardner Scott." He said, "Oh, yeah, Gardner Scott." And then he told me his story. A couple years ago, he was fighting cancer and was bedridden and was binge watching Gardner Scott videos. And he thanked me for helping get him through that time. And when I hear stories like that, I mean, it just squeezes my heart. It just makes me feel so wonderful. I'm making these videos to help people, and it's helping them on levels I can't even imagine. When I talk about the tips and tricks in the garden, when I talk about extending the season, trying new plants, experimenting, for me, I'm trying to pass information to you on how to grow a good garden. But really, what my channel is about is growing good gardeners. And you've heard me say this before. I think gardeners are special people. And so, through my efforts to educate gardeners, I'm hoping to make all of you a better person ultimately, and to make your life better. And so, to hear that someone watched my videos while they were fighting cancer and they won the battle, and the cancer went into remission, and they're doing great now. What is better than that? How can I top that? And he's not the first one to say things like that. Gardening is important on so many different levels, and becoming a gardener really does make your life better. And so every week, that's why I'm here, because it makes me a better person just being exposed to all of you and being part of this community. And so I I can't say it enough, and I say it every week. Thank you to all of you for helping to make my life better. And thank you to all of you who share your stories with me to let me know how important my videos have been to you and how it's impacted your life. It really does make a difference to all of us, because it makes me want to make more videos and to continue doing this on a regular basis. And so I will. And I'll be back next week doing this all over again and trying to come up with a topic that I think is appropriate for the time and season and for all of us at the different levels we are in our gardening journey. And I hope you'll be part of that journey as well as we continue. So thank you to all of you for everything that you provide to me. It's greatly appreciated. I'll see you next week, and enjoy gardening.